my shorts.
Now, well, people love it when we have a little discussion instead of just like focusing on news and stuff. So I want to talk about something. This is something I've been wanting to talk about for a few weeks. I wanted to wait for like a slow news week sort of thing.
Yep. And that's this week because
That's this week.
there was shitloads last week.
Yeah.
There's not much this
There's
week.
a little bit of news this week, which we'll touch on at the end. But this here, this is something that's come to my attention that it's a little bit, again, we're following this theme of my, what do you want to call it, my existential crisis of coming up to 30 years old.
What a crisis.
Yeah,
30 again.
I know. Someone brought to my attention that we are now as far from the 1980s as the 1980s was from the 1940s.
Oh, yeah. Good point. My God.
And this is now opening up a new debate over what should be considered classic
Well,
cinema.
the 2000s are from 1960s when I was born.
Well, yeah.
God.
So this has opened up a whole new debate over what should be considered classic cinema. Now, Nathan Fontaine, who's a follower of mine, long-time follower,
yes.
wonderful guy, he said that he watched Indiana Jones and it struck him that the original, Raiders of the Lost Ark, was inspired by 40s movies.
1940s, yeah.
1940s movies. And now that movie is 40 years old. Raiders of the Lost Ark. So at the time when that was made, it was inspired by 40-year-old movies, and Raiders is now 40 years old. So now this has kind of brought up this thing, which is like the 1980s are now as far... Well, we are now as far from the 1980s as the 80s was from the 1940s.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of a... We kind of got a little bit of a Twitter thing, and we're talking about it, and I guess I retweeted it and just kind of like... thought, oh shit, this is crazy. And it hit me that I've obviously got a lot of followers who are maybe even like in their 20s who see these movies as really old, like movies that were made in the 1980s. And even younger people now apparently believe that movies from like the 80s, 90s, and even maybe early 2000s are old films now.
God.
So I got in this little debate. I was almost like, to me, I can't consider movies from this period as classic Hollywood. But some people do. Because I feel it's really weird to lump something like, even something like Raiders of the Lost Ark with Casablanca. Like, that feels weird to me.
Yeah, it does a bit.
Like, we have always considered classic cinema as like that period between, I guess, the 1910s through to, it was probably
40s,
like the
50s,
well, I'd
yeah.
say 19, even pushing to the 1980s. Because I've always felt like people like Paul Newman, Robert Redford, all them, they were still at the height of their game in the 70s.
Suppose, yeah.
So you would put stuff like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid alongside Casablanca. I kind of feel like it
Smoking
fits.
Your Bandit. Or,
Yeah, in that kind of... But again, I'll get you to weigh in with kind of your opinion in a second. But I kind of had like almost this Twitter tiff with someone who was a fairly well-established critic. And I guess we must follow each other on Twitter. I believe they are a little bit older than me. But they believe that you can consider it a movie from the 80s or the 90s, part of classic cinema. Now, I believe you can consider movies from this period a classic.
Yep.
Raiders is a classic.
Yep.
Close Encounters.
Star Wars.
Well, Star Wars, yeah. Well, late 70s.
Yep.
But Empire Strikes Back is 1980.
Yep.
Classic. Return of the Jedi. Classic. 1983. Stuff like even The Lord of the Rings, which was early 2000s, is a classic of cinema. Braveheart, Gladiator. But I would not consider it classic cinema.
Oh, I've got a couple of views on this. One view is, for me, a lot of those films you're talking about, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, they were inspired by other films.
Yeah.
So the films that inspired them are classic cinema.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So we're talking things that were probably made, as you said, 1910 through to 1960, 70, whatever.
Yeah.
But a lot of the more recent films that people are now considering classic cinema.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could actually consider them as being classic cinema.
Yeah.
Because classic cinema, when I think of classic cinema, it's films, films that were groundbreaking. They told new stories.
Golden age of cinema.
Yeah, and a lot of the stories we see today are stories that have already been told.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's an original movie, you've seen it. It's been done before.
Yeah, exactly right. Because what was the theory that there was like three stories or four stories.
Well, most movies, most stories will follow the one formula, which is the hero's journey.
Yeah, exactly right.
Which is what Pixar uses on all of their films.
Yeah,
Star Wars followed it. The Akira Kurosawa films, like The Seven Samurai, The Magnificent Seven, which is the Seven Samurai. Yeah. The hit Forbidden Four. Every movie that has like a leading character who's fighting for good, it's the hero's journey.
Yeah,
and almost every story follows it.
But then there's another, and like High Noon's another one.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly right.
Earlier,
yeah.
Like,
right.
Yeah. Sorry. It's a bit of a choking there.
You're right.
Here we go again.
Take a little quick sip.
What was I saying?
Classic movies and the hero's journey and all that shit.
Yeah, so High Noon's a classic example of that.
Yeah.
Follows the hero's journey, all that stuff. And that inspired a lot of Westerns to come after it.
Yeah.
And even films that were only a few years after that. It probably inspired those as well.
Some way, probably, yeah.
A lot of Clint's films, Pale Rider and stuff like that.
Yeah, would have taken some
Would have taken something from that.
Yeah.
But then there's another thought where when you talk about like classic cars and stuff, you're talking 25, 30-year-old cars.
Yeah.
So is something that's 25 years old or 20 years old a classic?
Yeah, well, that's what you'd usually, That's
not what I would consider classic. For me, it is films that inspired other films that were made in early cinema, now, golden age of cinema.
Right, yeah. Well, for me, classic cinema is the golden age of cinema.
Yeah.
And there's such a distinctive period, again, where there are these new stories being told, or even a lot of these movies were based on books or plays or anything. So nothing's original to begin with.
Yeah.
But they're the first time these stories are being told on film, but the aesthetics of this period are so different to now.
Yeah.
And these were the movies that were inventing cinema as the art form that it is.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why we then fall back on everything these movies did, because they set the stage for everything that followed.
So even things like for me, like A New Hope, I would consider that as classic cinema.
Yeah, I would too.
And the reason for that is because it was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
It created new ways of doing things.
But like, okay, so we take Lord of the Rings, which was what, early 2000s-ish probably.
Yeah. Now
they were very, very groundbreaking movies. So is that classic cinema? You're still groundbreaking in the early 2000s because they're developing digital filmmaking.
Yeah, that's true. But are they telling new stories as well? Like A New Hope, that was really a new story. Well,
no, because that's the hero's journey.
Yeah, true, I suppose.
That's just the
Kurosawa
films.
When you look at romance films, most of that can be taken back to Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
The classic.
It's interesting.
Story.
Now he was something funny.
It's a bizarre thought.
He was something funny, right? Well, because someone chimed in and said, I can't remember who it was, but they said they had asked their friends' kids if they wanted to watch Back to the Future, and the kids replied with, "We've never watched black and white movies." Right, Back to the Future, 1980s, early 90s.
That's hilarious.
So I don't know. I think it's weird, and I think that a lot of people have different thoughts on this, that you're so far out now, these movies that were made in the 80s and the 90s, you're 30 or 40 years out from, you can consider them classic cinema. At the end of the day, it's all just terminology. It's all
exactly.
What do you call it? What's the word I'm looking for here? Semantics.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep.
That's all it is. But I feel like there's just such a vast difference between those movies made in those early days of cinema, even from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. I don't know, but then I kind of think of it and I feel like cinema now is very different to what it was in the 80s and the 90s. Maybe there's 3 periods of cinema now. You know, you've got that golden age, those what I would consider classics. You've got the middle age, and then you've got this new era. I think maybe it's the time where we need to reassess how we're labeling films.
That's a thought. I mean, because you got that whole like with Disney films and stuff, or even like Marvel and DC and stuff. You've got all different ages.
Yeah. We've got the golden age of comics, the silver age, the bronze age, and the Disney periods, the golden age, pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
The silver age, the whatever.
So is that the way you've got to look at cinema now?
Oh, maybe.
I feel mainstream film, or
because we have passed an entire period or generation of films, 1980s to 2020s, which is that same period as that early age of cinema.
Yep.
So we have like these 3, we're going into like this new age. Cinema's not that old. It's like 100 and like 15, 20 years old or whatever. It's like, whatever. Cinema's not been around that long
18
in the whole scheme of everything.
Yeah.
Cinema was still being pioneered through to now. You think about digital cinema, like we've hit this...
But like even if you're looking at more modern stuff, where you've got digital technology and stuff taking over, I don't know whether just because they're groundbreaking in that regard, whether you really consider it as being classic cinema.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Because they're the same stories, just being presented in a different manner.
Yeah, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to get at. The idea of considering something like, okay, Die Hard to me is a film that is classic. That's a classic film.
It's a classic film, but
it's not classic cinema.
That's right.
It's not classic cinema. Yeah. Whereas some people don't see that difference, and they will go, no, that is classic cinema. And some of these people I was speaking to, they were like, why can't you put Casablanca next to Die Hard? They're both old movies. But it feels weird to me. And I don't know, maybe is this because this next part of it is this because I've been alive in this kind of period where these movies were made? And does the period that you are born, the era where you're born, change the way you look at things? So obviously,
no doubt.
You got 10, 15, 20-year-olds now are looking at a movie like Die Hard and going, that's fucking old.
Yeah.
So to them, what do we got? 80, 90, 2000, 20, it's a 40-year-old movie, right? It would be like a 40-year-old movie. So to them, that would be like Cool Hand Luke to me as a kid.
Yeah.
Right? And you're looking back at Die Hard, even like Star Wars The Phantom Menace is like 30 years old.
Oh, Jesus.
And 30, is that right? That is right. No, 20 years. 99. So 22 years, nearly 25 years old. So even that is as old as something like a movie from the 70s was. Paul Newman, Robert Redford films.
So you're trying to tell me that Phantom Menace is a classic?
But younger people would think it is because it's an old movie. This is just the idea of people lumping old movies together, but I feel like they shouldn't be. I still feel like there is just very specific eras, very specific. Interesting, when I worked at FOP, HMV store over in Cambridge, they had their, what I would consider classic cinema, they had that labelled as vintage. That's the vintage.
Okay.
And I think over in the UK, they do consider classic cinema vintage.
Right.
So you have the vintage era. Now, how would you label cars? You've got vintage cars, which are like 20s, 30s, 40s cars, right?
Yep.
And then you would have what would you consider cars like 50s, 60s, 70s? Classics?
Well, yeah. See, vintage for me would be, A model Fords and stuff like that. So, 20s, 30s, 40s. And classics. I mean, even like I watch a lot of those car shows, and they refer to cars as being classics.
Yeah,
and we're talking about car 50s and 60s.
Yeah. So maybe this is now how we start. Maybe the classics have now become that middle 40 years, and the vintage films are the old things.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
I think I'm happy with that. Actually,
that'll work.
I think that works. It's just now a matter of working your head around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what this comes down to is it's really just a perspective of time.
Oh, there's
depending on when you're born, and
because someone that's born today,
yeah,
will look back at stuff that's being made today,
yeah,
and think, geez, that was made 20 years before.
Yeah.
That was made when I was born. That's so old.
Yeah.
Or film that was made when you were the year you were born.
Yeah.
People are being born today. They'll go, geez, that's old. By the time they're 20, that'll be 50 years old.
Well, movies like Titanic, Gladiator, Braveheart, these movies that were made in the 90s, Adam Sandler comedies.
Yeah.
You know, they are. A lot of them you look back now and you go, that's very dated.
So even something like Avatar. What year was Avatar?
Oh, Avatar was 2010. But still, But
still, someone born today, by the time they're 20, that's a 30-year-old film.
Hey, by the time James Cameron gets through his next 5 Avatars, it's going to be like 20... no, seriously, it's going to be like 2032 or something. So the first movie will be 20 years old.
God.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't know. I think it's interesting.
I think you're right. I mean, classic... Yeah, you can sort of do that. You can say, oh, well, that's classic and they're vintage.
The vintage, yeah. I think maybe that's what we have to do now. It's weird. But again, I think... I don't know. I don't know whether it's because the older I'm getting or just the more that I'm just really interested in like the whole idea of like the history of the universe and all that shit. But what a lot of people don't realize is that we're here for such a small amount of time.
That's right.
And we judge... I don't know. We judge these things just dependent on our own perspective. And we see like, oh, we've been alive for 20, but we're just such like a speck. Like there's that idea of the cosmic calendar where you put the entire history of the universe in a calendar, the entire history of mankind, the creation of the world and the dinosaurs and cavemen and all of us, all of this history that we know about happens in the last second of the last day on the cosmic calendar. And that is how how insignificant and how tiny our like amount of time. That all of that, of billions of years, is the last second of the last day of the cosmic calendar. So it really comes down to like this idea of your perception of time, your
timeline. Yeah.
And the longer time goes on, the more you have to start reassessing how things fit in. And really, in the scheme of the cosmic calendar, Casablanca was made pretty much exactly the same time that Billy Madison was.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I think it's just a weird way you have to come about looking at it. One thing I was going to say is like, how would you consider? We've probably moved on a little bit, but I'm interested to know how you would see, because I say that I would consider what we're now branding the vintage age of cinema. I would say it's probably from like the 2010s to the 1970s, because I feel like that's all right up to the end of the 1970s. So for me, that's like bang, right? That's that period, because I feel like that's the period that really fits together. But because you were born in the 1960s, and now I'm saying movies from the 60s and 70s are vintage or classic cinema, how do you see them? Do you see those movies as being... would you put Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid next to Casablanca?
Probably would, yeah.
You probably would.
I probably would.
Maybe you're just old enough to now go, okay, this old movie, they're old movies.
Yeah, but you're right. For me, anything pretty much prior to my birth, is like
vintage. Old movies. So then, how would you consider something like made in the 60s, the 70s? Would you still see them as part of that old?
I'd see them as classic.
So you wouldn't see. So you wouldn't. Okay, that's the question.
But sorry, this is a tough one for me, because I would consider them as some of them as being classic. Yeah.
I would put now.
I can't explain it.
I would put
because there'd be films like when was Cool Hand Luke made?
What, like 1960s, I guess.
Okay,
to have a look.
So
or was that 70s?
I would class that as being a classic film.
Yeah.
And is that because it was Paul Newman?
Well, I think for me that's part of it. 67. So for me, the idea is that these but then
what you would consider as being almost the original Hollywood actor.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of. But then,
Cary Grant and
I would bun. Yeah, but Cary. That's the next weird thing. Cary Grant, Bogart, James Cagney, Jimmy Stewart. They were doing movies in the 20s.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they kind of phased out by the time you get the new breed, which is Paul Newman, Robert Redford,
Steve McQueen,
Jane Fonda, all those. And then the new breed after that is George Clooney, it's Brad Pitt, it's Julia Roberts, that. And then we've even got this new wave coming through.
So has it got something to do with the actors and the actresses?
Yeah,
that were in these things?
I think so. I don't know. But anyway, I think it does come down to the idea of perception. Okay, so my question, this should kind of just gauge how you see movies. Like, I would put Paul Newman, I would put Cool Hand Luke and Casablanca in the same bracket. But would you, personally?
Yeah.
You would?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you would see that as they're old movies.
Well, I'm old. So.
Yeah, so yeah. Okay, that's interesting. It's just interesting because I'm kind of trying to gauge the theory that it's the people's perception of time, and just considering things old.
Well, God, I don't know how to think about it. It's such confusing.
It is. Isn't it? Again, end of the day, semantics is really what it comes down to. But it's like
the classic Hollywood actors for me are people like Cary Grant and Bogart and
we've got Cary Grant going up to the 60s or 70s anyway.
And Paul Newman and Robert Redford, and these guys, for me, are classic Hollywood actors. Mm. Whereas I don't consider people like George Clooney or Brad Pitt or any of these guys have been classic actors. Yeah. They're very good actors, and in time they'll probably become classic actors. And it gets back to that. Yeah. It's just a perception of time. When you're born and all those sorts. So someone born in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we'll look back at George Clooney and Brad Pitt and go, oh, geez, these old actors were fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, we could go around in loops all day, but I think we've kind of nailed it. It's a perception of how you view your point in history and these things that have come before and how you can lump them. I think that you have to take into consideration the actors, you have to take into consideration the period that they were made in, the people that are making the films. Vintage, let's brand it vintage cinema. 1910s up until like the late 1970s.
Yep.
1980s up until, I guess, 2020.
Yeah.
Which is the 40-year bracket. Yeah. And then because we're seeing these new actors coming through now.
Yeah, exactly right.
You know, who are now blowing up, I guess.
Yep. Michael B. Jordan and actors like that.
Saoirse Ronan, people that are doing all these smaller indie films and stuff. Margot Robbie, the people doing the Marvel films, all that kind of shit. I feel like, you've got this new era now. Crazy. At the dawning of a new age.
Yeah.
It's crazy, man.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to look at it.
Every 40 years seems like a fairly good... Yeah. Because I guess that would be like the average lifespan
of a classic
actor. Of an actor. Yeah. The lifespan of like a creative is 40 years. Well, there you go.
You're probably
Let's knock that down.
Yeah.
Done.
Good.
I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say on this. Tweet me or whatever it is. But yeah, it's just a very strange topic that's kind of had me going around because I'm seeing a lot of the actors that I grew up with in films. Eddie Murphy, Ben Stiller.
Yep.
I guess people who would do like the height of their game in the 1990s. Even Clooney, Brad Pitt, Julia Roberts, Sandra Bullock.
Yep.
They're older now.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
I watch movies now. Age. Yeah, and I'm watching movies now and I'm thinking these guys are kind of at that point in their career where you look back and you watch Paul Newman in a 90s film and you think, oh, he's a bit this is one of his later films.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a bit older here. Yeah. So now I'm looking at these actors and going, oh, they're kind of at that point in their career now where they are the older breed.
Yeah, the back end of it.
Yeah, so it's these weird ways that we see things. Anyway,
that's probably for sure.
Let's put a nail in that one.
Vintage,
classic, new era.
Yep.
Yeah. Now let's do a ranking of every single vintage movie ever made. Ranking of every single...
Okay, Pub, you got about 3 weeks.
Hey everyone, if you haven't yet, smash that big old subscribe button up on your screen to keep up to date with all my content and hit that like button down below. Also, don't forget to check me out on social media and please consider supporting me over on Patreon for as little as $1 a month for exclusive videos, early access content and to get your name up on the screen. Thanks again for watching.